Welcome to this special Another Europe Zoom event on the French presidential elections 2022. I'm Seema Syeda, campaigns officer at Another Europe is Possible, and I'll be chairing this discussion today. This evening, we're very excited to be joined live from France by three very dedicated activists. We have Mouna Bougerra from the Union of French Muslim Democrats. We have Bernard Dreano from the Paris-based Center for Initiatives and Studies on International Solidarity. And we have Bouna from the France-based FUIQP, the United Front of Immigrant and Working Class Neighborhoods. Now, I'm sure many of us sighed a breath of relief when Emmanuel Macron defeated Marine Le Pen this Sunday in the second round of the French presidential election. But ultimately, Macron was the lesser of two evils, and for many in France, the fight is not over. Pitching himself originally as neither of the left nor the right, we've seen Macron come down hard on social movements, using harsh authoritarian measures to shut down protests. We've seen him ramp up racism and Islamophobia, reinforcing far-right discourse and strengthening the far-right vote. His economic agenda is a neoliberal one. Rather than addressing social problems, it stokes them further. So this conversation is a hugely important one, not just for people in France, but also for those of us who are joining from the UK and who are also seeing a dangerous shift to the far right from our government through the Brexit project and up to now. With a policing bill criminalizing protest organizers here and shutting down noisy and annoying protests, and the Nationality and Borders Bill criminalizing refugees and threatening them with deportation to Rwanda, we in the UK are facing similar battles, and we have much to learn from you in France. Hopefully this is only the start of a mutual endeavor of building links and solidarity across social movements. So without further ado, our first speaker is Mouna Bougerra. Mouna is a teacher, activist, anti-racism and anti-Islamophobia campaigner. She's a member of the Union of French Muslim Democrats Party, and she's standing in the forthcoming legislative elections of June 2022. Mouna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Seema. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me today. We're going to discuss a very serious subject. So I will start by trying to talk about how Islamophobia has been rising in France for the last 2 decades, and how obsessional our society has become on the hijab and the headscarf. The law banning Islamic headscarves in state schools, which was voted in 2004, violates the rights to freedom of religion and expression. That's what Human Rights Watch said. In fact, no government should regulate how women can dress, whether they can wear a hijab or take it off. The very basic principle of laicity and secularism is based on the fact that religion, especially Christianity, does not rule our country anymore. But on the other hand, the government is not supposed to interfere into religious matters either. By dictating our imams what they should or shouldn't say during their sermons, the Charter of Imams flouts our freedom of religion, our liberty of conscience and faith. And as I said earlier, there is an obsession in France about the hijab. This fixation dates back to the period of colonization in North Africa. Throughout the 19th century, the Muslim veil functioned as an object of fascination for Europeans. European photographers produced representations of women lifting their veils and exposing their naked bodies. These reproductions were made as postcards, and these images were circulated across the Mediterranean, constructing the image of a Muslim women whose erotic powers could be unleashed once the veil was lifted. So in 1958, during the Algerian War of Independence, mass unveiling ceremonies were staged across Algeria, and the wives of French military officers unveiled some Algerian women to show that they were siding with their French sisters. It was deeply humiliating for them. So following these staged unveilings, many Algerian women decided to wear the hijab, and they wanted to make clear that they would define the terms of their emancipation rather than being forcefully liberated by the French colonizers. So what we notice today is a sort of witch hunt. Colonization has ended, and yet some people still want to dictate us how we should dress and what we shouldn't be wearing. Muslim women are facing double discrimination. They suffer from sexism and Islamophobia. As women, they are often patronized, and if they choose to wear a hijab, they are discriminated against in every aspect of their life. It starts at school, and then it goes further in the professional world. And lately, a law was passed, and women wearing a hijab can no longer participate in sports competitions. So some politicians have also suggested a ban to ban hijab from university and even from the public sphere, arguing that religion is personal and that these women should be wearing their hijab at home, which is ridiculous. Politicians are not the only ones to blame for the rise of Islamophobia in France, because actually we must not forget that the media, a lot of the media, has also normalized anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim hate speech. Last week, for example, French media accused Muslims of stealing sheep during Ramadan, prompting farmers to commit suicide, and blamed them for causing a shortage of sunflower oil in the supermarkets due to Ramadan. So the media in French are they are encouraged in spreading Islamophobia without ever being challenged. It's part of an agenda set to turn Muslims into scapegoats of the country. By blaming them for all the crises, they are only reproducing the same narratives that the Nazis used to do for Jews in the 1930s. We are targeted as the enemy within. So now let's talk about the anti-separatism bill, which was voted last year. It was widely seen as an attack on freedom of association, but it's also a law that has legalized Islamophobia in a country where Islamophobia has already is already on the rise, actually. So former Interior Minister Christophe Castaner was asked to specify what it meant, what he meant by signs of religious radicalization, and he listed the following: a rigorous religious practice, especially during Ramadan. He said that wearing a beard for men was also a sign of radicalization, a regular practice of ritual prayer. The friction mark on the forehead, on a Muslim's forehead, is also a sign of radicalization. But to us, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, none of those, even taken together, can be described as religious extremism or even signs of jihadist radicalization. They are nonetheless listed on various French governmental counter-terrorism web pages in a shameful display of bigotry and ignorance towards Muslims and Islam. Whenever a Muslim tries to push back against injustices and discriminations, they are immediately accused of radicalization, extremism, political Islam, or Islamism. I'm sorry, my computer is slow. So as I said, Muslims are facing Islamophobia for now nearly 2 decades, for more than 2 decades. And Emmanuel Macron, during his first term, has given direct orders to his ministers to launch a sort of witch hunt against Muslims. And he has been, I'm sorry, my computer has shut down. Whatever, doesn't matter. So yes, Emmanuel Macron is guilty. We hold him responsible for the rise of the far-right ideology. Eric Zemmour gathered 7% of the votes, and Marine Le Pen 42% on the second round. And if France is sadly becoming an increasingly racist and Islamophobic society, it is his fault. The previous presidents share responsibility, but we hold Emmanuel Macron as responsible for the rise of Islamophobia in France. He has been shutting down mosques, more than 700 mosques, schools, NGOs, organizations such as CCIF, which is an organization that fights Islamophobia and defends the victims of Islamophobia. So during his first term, Emmanuel Macron has done he has helped the far right ideology increase in France, and how has become now today very concerning. The Muslim community is very concerned, and that is the reason why in 2012 Najib Azergui decided to create a party called the Union of French Muslim Democrats, following these laws, these Islamophobic laws. French Muslims are fed up. They no longer want to be scapegoated. We don't want to be pointed at as the main problem in France. We have faced several crises, such as the yellow vest, even the coronavirus crisis, and we are facing many. There are many issues that should be tackled, but yet Islam and Muslims are the main subject. It has been the main subject during the presidential election, and also in the media. Whenever you turn your TV on in France, all you can hear is Islam, Muslim, Islamism, terrorism, and they conflate everything whenever there is a terrorist attack. So they use it as a pretext to how shall I say, to take away our liberties, basically. So our party has been created 10 years ago, considering that they had made us a political problem, making the Muslims a political problem. Therefore, we needed to give a political answer to this problem, basically. So as you said, I am running for the legislative election in June, because we have decided that all the parties, the left included, are not so anti-racist as they pretend they are. Islamophobia is not their priority as it is for us. The Palestinian issue as well, police brutality, a double standard society we're living in. All these issues are very important to us. And we have decided that if we want something done, we should do it ourselves. So that's why Muslims in France have decided to get involved in the political field, basically. We have been disappointed by the 5 years under Emmanuel Macron's rule. He promised he would fight racism and Islamophobia. He actually did exactly the opposite. So we are very concerned about what will happen during during his second term, because as I said, far-right ideology has spread upon the political chessboard, and today, apart from Jean-Luc Mélenchon, nobody ever dares defending Muslims, basically. And even Mélenchon, actually, yes, even Mélenchon used to be anti-clerical, he used to be Islamophobic as well. He said that wearing a hijab is self-stigmatization, and he changed his mind. He has been evolving for the last 3 years, but we are not fooled anymore.
Thank you, Monia. That's such a really important insight into what's been going on in France, especially the extent to which Macron himself has been normalizing Islamophobia and also institutionalizing Islamophobia through the legal system too. If anyone has any questions about this, please do use the question and answer box to put some questions through, and we'll come back to you after all of the speakers. We'll have a discussion. So our next speaker is Bernard Dreano. Bernard is the chairperson of the Center for Initiatives and Studies on International Solidarity based in Paris. Bernard has been working with Another Europe on delivering international no more war citizens assemblies, and he will share his thoughts on the wider internal and international context of this presidential election. Thank you, Bernard.
Thank you. First of all, I agree with what Mouna just said about the importance of Islamophobia in France. We'll say a little more about it, but I will also give a more general scope. Since 20 years now, we have some kind of neoliberal reactionary trend in France, like in other countries in Western Europe, which include part of the so-called left. Both on the economical point of view and the social point of view, and also on the racist, the Islamophobic point of view. Must immediately underline that to a certain extent, it comes from above. I mean, this racist trend. Of course, you have a phenomenon of racism in France, in the society. You had always, and you have still, and it's also from a colonial state, so it has some legacy. But the fact is that this last decade, you had a new form of racism coming from above, coming from intellectuals, coming from some institutional circles, coming from some ministry, coming from the media, which is in a way you can say that the French society is less racist than its elite. That's an interesting phenomenon. Nevertheless, you had this rise of extreme right. And of course, the extreme right in France has also a long legacy. It's come, Front National and Jean-Marie Le Pen date back from the time of colonial wars, and it's developed all along. It's clearly extreme right, racist, even if in the last years, Marine Le Pen tried to what she called diabolization of the party, to make it less extremist. Nevertheless, the core is still there. What is interesting is to see why she was able to gather so many votes. And that's also a long process. If you look carefully at the result of this election, which are the result of several years of evolution, you can see several things. First of all, the trend in all elections in France these last years of disappointment of popular classes, working class, people in the outskirts of the cities, but also people lower middle class, small white people, let's say, started to abstain, not to go to election anymore. And when they were going, very often they were voting for the extreme right. This phenomenon was not always adhesion to extreme right position, but very often a way of a protest vote. Could be both. In this last election, that's a phenomenon that we have seen since several years, and affecting especially the left, and in the left, the Communist Party, for example, or the more or less radical left, and to a certain extent, the social democratic left too. At the same time, the conservatives, the traditional right-wing parties, were less affected because their electorate was ordinarily old people, upper middle class, and some rural areas, and they kept, to a certain extent, part of their voters. Nevertheless, we had this Sarkozy time with the right conservative in power. We have the Hollande time when we had the social democrat in power. If you think about what happened during this time, you don't see the difference. I mean, if you can see the difference on very small details, but you had the impression that it was more or less the same politics, neoliberal politics, and also, as it has been raised already, this racism from above, especially in its Islamophobic form, and also a quite violent social policy. When I mean violent, I don't only mean violent socially, but also violent physically. It's a sort of impunity of the police, and with the clash against the social movement, which were more and more strong since, let's say, 2008, 2009. Macron was give the impression he was going to, let's say, not be leftist or not be progressist, but be, let's say, more liberal in the traditional sense of the word, and less repressive, more open, and of course it was not at all. It was he followed exactly what was done before. Just to give you an example, if you take the laws that has been passed since 15 years, and if Marine Le Pen had won the election, she would have been able to have a totally authoritarian state immediately without changing any regulation or any laws, because there is the means through the laws passed by the majorities before, by Macron or by Hollande, not to create exactly a dictatorship, but to create an authoritarian state like in Hungary, for example. And we can see that also in a certain number of aggressive activities against, we will always speak about the Muslim, but also about a lot of kind of radical movements. And we have seen that quite a lot with the repression of the Gilets jaunes, of the yellow vest, which was a very peculiar phenomenon, a very new phenomenon in the French context. But maybe we have not the time to develop. If you can explain that in details a few years ago in Open Democracy, you can just look at it, the yellow vest. Anyway, what is interesting in this election is that we had a few positive phenomena. Probably it was a catastrophe. 13 million of people voting for the extreme right is not a good news. People obliged to vote for Macron, well, but quite a lot did, because they think that between two evils you choose less. It's not a very good thing for democracy. But we had this relatively encouraging result of the left, especially through Jean-Luc Mélenchon. There would be a lot of things to say about Jean-Luc Mélenchon. His party is not very democratic in its structure. It has some default. Even if recent evolution is, let's say, globally positive, but the fact is that he was able to gather nearly 1/3 of the votes. I mean, the left together was able to have 1/3 of the votes. He was at a quite high level, 22% of the votes, was something encouraging and can have some effect in coming legislative election. We will see, because with the electoral system we have in France, it's not obvious what's going to happen. But there is another phenomenon which has to be stressed. It's partial. It's not in all France. It's not everywhere. But we had the phenomenon then in a certain number of popular districts, especially in the outskirts of Paris and Lyon. People were not voting anymore, especially among the popular districts, including people from Muslim background, went to vote much more than before, in a way to stop Le Pen and Macron. And that's very interesting in itself. It's not totally general. In the north of France, a lot of people from popular background voted for Marine Le Pen. We have also the very strange situation in the overseas territories, especially in the Caribbean, where at the first round of the presidential election, more than 50% of the people voted for Mélenchon, the left, more than 55%, even 60%. The second round, the same number, even more, voted for Marine Le Pen. Even if the same people, even if the Rassemblement National and the extreme right is very low. It's a racist party, but nevertheless, there was such revolt against Macron, they were ready to shift from left to right, just to vote against Macron. So that's a phenomenon in itself, which means that we have some specificities like that. Now the problem is what to do with it. We hope that we will have kind of progressive dynamic. The best should be the capacity of blocking Macron counter reforms and building in the future a leftist progressist alternative, but of course it's not sure it's going to happen. Of course, a big business, European leaders, international leaders in general, want stability, and they were supporting Macron, and they are quite, they were a bit afraid of having some kind of Viktor Orban in power in a country like France, but it didn't happen because there was also strong pressure from big business to stop that. So that's what I can say in as a first introduction of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Bernard. And the role of these successive neoliberal governments in creating disaffection over a number of years is a really important historic perspective on this.
I can add something I forgot. It's about the vote of young people. If you compare to UK, the ecologist movement, I mean the environmental movement, if you look at what's going on in the streets, it's smaller than in the UK, in France. But if you look at the polls, it is the same. I mean, the young people are massively supporting ecology, which doesn't mean that they are going to vote for the Green Party. That's another story. Because the candidate of the Green Party only got 4.8% of the votes. But Macron was in real minority among the youth, especially because of ecology. And that's also something quite interesting, because to a certain extent, the success of Mélenchon can be explained also because he had a rather radical ecological program.
Thank you, Bernard. Yes, that's incredibly important, the role of the youth and where this is going for the future. Again, if anyone has any questions, please do post them in the question and answer box. We're going to be coming to that part of the session soon. Our next speaker is Bouna Mbaye. Born in Senegal, Bouna grew up in the suburbs of Paris and has worked for humanitarian organizations for several years. He's a member of the United Front of Immigrant and Working Class Neighborhoods, the FUIQP. This is an organization based in France and dedicated to fighting racial, class-based and gender oppression. Bouna, over to you.
Thank you, Seema, and thank you to the forum. Another Europe is possible for giving us the opportunity to discuss, as an insider, the outcome of the presidential election in France. Welcome this opportunity because, you know, sometimes we are so much absorbed in our domestic problems that we tend to forget that there are things happening in other parts of the world, right? So this is also a platform where we'll be able to exchange with people from the UK or other parts of Europe about what's has been unfolding in France and how it might affect even the international relations between France and those countries, and also the type of dynamics that we can create to, you know, create some bridges of solidarity between the anti-racist movements in France, in Africa, and also in Europe. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. So last week, last Sunday, we had to choose between a candidate that had a big stick, right, a police bludgeon, and another candidate who had an AK-47, right? So the choice was between, basically for people like me or people with immigrant background, the choice was between going to the hospital or going to the morgue, right? So we reluctantly voted for Macron, despite the fact that we were perfectly aware that he's part of the problem. Actually, he created the problems that he wanted to solve. And most of the people who reluctantly voted for Macron, they fell into his trap. So we have to consider that he's a master of political manipulation, right? His genius of political manipulation. It's not because that he's our political foe, he's our political enemy, that we're not going to acknowledge that he's very gifted when it comes to manipulation, right? So at the United Front of Immigration in Popular Neighborhoods, we believe that the oppressed groups, if they want to emancipate themselves from domination, they need to come up with a clear and profound analysis, examining the tools that will enable them to, get rid of the domination, right? So in terms of analysis, what I learned from this election is 4 main lessons, right? So the first one is that there is a big crisis of democratic legitimacy of the French political system. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because Macron finally got only 38% of the votes of the people who registered, right? He was elected president with less than 40% of the electoral college, all the people who registered to vote. And he also got elected this time, losing 2 million votes compared to the previous presidential election in 2017, and also with the highest rate of non-participation since 1969. So actually, during the second round, there is 28% of people who could vote who didn't turn out, right? So this is a confirmation of a trend that we've been observing over the past, I would say, 20 years, because in 2002, only 19% of the people who could have voted didn't vote for a second round, right? In 2007, it was 25%, right? And in 2017, it was, in 2017, it was 25%. So this time is even higher than the previous elections. And we should also bear in mind that during the past regional elections that were held in 2021, only 35%, actually less than 35% of people who were registered did not vote. So there's a big crisis of legitimacy of this political system. There is a big chunk of the French electorate that is tired of these politicians and the type of political offers they're coming up with. So this is the first lesson, sorry. The second lesson is that we've given the keys of the French car, right, to Macron, but he's driving us on a highway that is leading us straight to Le Pen, right? Why I'm saying that? Because as the previous speakers pointed out, Macron has been implementing some policies that are very similar to those that Marine Le Pen would have implemented if she was elected, right? You can also see it in his rhetoric, his political rhetoric, which has completely changed, starting from, I would say, early 2019, and it coincided with the eruption of the Yellow Vest movement. So after the surge of the Yellow Vest movement, he started the approach and the discourse he had on migration. So in 2019, for example, in September 2019, at the Congress of his party, meeting of his party, he said, he asked a member of his party if they wanted to become the bourgeois party, right? Because the bourgeois, they don't live with migrants. Unless, unlike the working class who are still living with migrants, right? So he was basically saying that the reason why the left parties lost the working class votes is because they've been focusing more on migrant issues rather than working class issues. He didn't say white working class, but everybody could guess that what he was meaning, right? So he was racializing somehow the political discourse on migration and also socio-economic contradiction between the different social classes in France. So in 2020, his party at the National Assembly, they voted a law on asylum and migration, a law that toughened, right, the conditions of obtaining, documents in France, and also the residence of the migrants here in France, right? And taking advantage of another terrorist attack that took place in 2021. There is a professor who was beheaded by a student, radicalized student, who did it in the name of Islam, as many terrorists, unfortunately. These are awful attacks that happen, and they took advantage of that terrorist attack to vote the so-called separatist law. So the separatist law has justified the continuous harassment, intimidation, and repression of Muslims, right? So to me, Macron has been perpetrating colonial policy that has three pillars. It was tested in the colonies, and is still perpetuated in the context, in the current context in France. It has three pillars. The first one is cooptation, right? Cooptation means that you're going to select people with immigrant background, right, who will speak on behalf of the majority, but they will be promoted and they will get benefits and prestige, material prestige or symbolic prestige, only under the condition that they remain silent on the oppression of the vast majority of people with immigrant background. The second was intimidation. Intimidation implies character assassination. You're going to tarnish the reputation of the people who are fighting against racism, or you're going to organize a campaign in the press to discredit their struggle. And the last stage, the last pillar is repression. That's what he's been doing with a lot of Muslim organizations. I won't give as many details as Mouna. I think she already discussed it. She already gave some very powerful examples, so I don't think I need to give you more examples, especially since we don't have that much time. So the third lesson is that there is a fringe, conspicuous and extremely powerful fringe of the French bourgeoisie, of the French economic elite, that is willing to choose fascism as a political option. The reason I'm saying that is because there are some billionaires, a few billionaires, who've been very active in promoting through the media and through the media and also through their publishing houses, a fascist candidate called Zemmour, right? So Zemmour, for those who don't know, was born in 1958, so he's 63 years old. So he became famous in France because he was one of the leading figures of the politically incorrect discourse here in France, right? So he's been sentenced several times in court for inciting racial hatred against Muslims, Arabs, and Blacks in France, right? So the last one was in 2019, 2021, because he said that the unaccompanied minors with Muslim background are all criminals and rapists, and they should be expelled from France. And his party was baptized Reconquête, which is the French translation of Reconquista. So Reconquista, for those who know European history, is the moment when the Spanish kingdoms expelled the Muslims and the Jews from Spain and Portugal. They completed it in 1492, so at the end of the 15th century, right? So through the name of his party, he's explicitly showing that his project is a project of racial hatred and even ethnic cleansing, because the Reconquista also coincided with the policy of limpieza de la sangre in Spanish, which means blood purification, right? Ethnic purification. So this is the type of political candidates. As Mouna said, he got only 7% of the votes, which is very low compared to all the means that if you take into account all the propaganda that he benefited from, it was very low, but still they were sending a very powerful message, right? And the fourth lesson, the last one for me, the very important one, is that this election has showed that the racial divisions the ethno-racial divisions within the French society have reached their height in the current context. And this is something very important to bear in mind for the so-called left-leaning or leftist movements, who, at least in the French context, are still blindfolded, okay, theoretically and politically, because they don't want to see the scope of the racial divisions, the scope of racism. Some of them are still arguing that class should be the determining factor of the political engagement of individuals. This is not really the case, especially since now you have a growing number of the working class, so-called working class, white working class to be precise, people who are increasingly voting for Le Pen, right? Bernard mentioned some of the factors why they have turned from the Communist Party to Le Pen, but it is absolutely preoccupying. And if you don't deal with that problem, I think that the so-called left-leaning movements will face a crisis that will last for several years, because some of them still do not want to acknowledge the scope and the depth of the racial division within the French society. It is something that has been exacerbated by Macron and his people like him. As Bernard said, it is a top-down process. It is state-sponsored racism that has also contaminated part of the working class, right? So these are the 4 lessons that we learned from this election. So in this context, what I have been doing as an anti-racist, anti-imperialist organization, we've been visibilizing, we've been publicizing the struggles of those who are fighting racism, right? For example, the association that have been shut down by Macron through our website and also through demonstrations. We gave them visibility, and we'll continue doing it. We'll continue participating in political platforms where these people who do not necessarily have a voice in the media will be able to express themselves, to express their concerns, and to escape the intimidation that is imposed both by Macron, his supporters, and also part of the left, right? For example, on the 4th of April, we organized a meeting that was called Liberty, Equality, and Anti-Racism, where we were able to gather participants from various backgrounds. So you had intellectuals, public intellectuals, you had activists who are involved in, for example, people are fighting against police brutality. So we had victims, relatives of victims of police brutality, people whose relatives have been killed by the police of the past few years. You also had members of other anti-racist groups, including undocumented migrants. So these are people you don't necessarily hear in the media. So the idea is to build some bridges between those groups who have, whose interest is to unite, but who have been divided for several reasons. So the image I would give as a conclusion is that the anti-racist movement is like a hand, right, whose fingers are separated for the moment. But all we need to do, that is easy to say, but not necessarily easy to implement, is to bring the hands together to make the fist, right? The same fist that is the logo of our organization. And this is the only way we can counterbalance the tendency of demonizing, criminalizing the migrants. The fight will not be easy, but we'll need your support. And together we can make it, knowing that if we surrender, we're all finished. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Bouna. I did let you go on a bit longer there, and I'm glad I did, because that was a great analogy at the end, which I'm sure I would like to use myself in some future meetings. But now we have lots of questions, and we've got a bit of time left for that. So I'll ask a few of the questions and then bat them back over to you. So one of the questions we have is from Felicity de Mota, who says, the problem Mélenchon has is trying to keep his philosophy pure and wanting to avoid combining with other parties in electoral pacts. In light of this, where do you think the future lies? We also have another question from Alan Yersley, who says, some French politicians and political commentators have argued that the current regime, the Fifth Republic, is no longer fit for purpose, and have called for constitutional reforms for a Sixth Republic. Do you agree with that? What reforms would you like to see in the Sixth Republic? Should the voting system be changed to a form of proportional representation rather than the two-round system? And should there be more devolution of powers to the regions, departments, and communes? I'm going to leave those 2 questions out there for now, and I'll try to make it visible to the audience. Would anyone like to pick up on either of those questions in the panel? Bernard, sorry, let me unmute you. You should have an option to unmute. Perfect.
Yes. The second question first. The first, the other can also answer. We need a Sixth Republic. A lot of people agree on that, but we have to. But what does that mean? It's not always clear, because it's not only the electoral system. The problem of the regime in France, it's a bit like in UK. I mean, the regime is different, but we have a similar problem. First of all, this presidential problem, this presidential system, create how to say, a tendency to authoritarianism, centralism in nature. And of course, it's even worse today because all of the factors are playing a role in this form. And it gives no power to the parliament. I mean, the parliament and the parliament election are following the presidential elections, so it's combined. It's not even like in the United States where you have a check and balance system. You have no balance. Second, we have an administrative system which is became extremely complex. Nobody understands how it works because it's supposed to be decentralized, but it's also centralized, but it's relatively confused. And so that's also a big problem for democracy because the people don't understand who decide what. These last 20 years, a lot of people have said we must decentralize the French state. So there was some power given to the region, but nobody understands exactly what the power are. And the central state is still very strong. Also because of the presidential system. And now, of course, we need proportional elections, which is there are different possibility of proportional elections. It exists in all the European countries except UK and France. And that's not a chance because UK and France have both former empire. It wouldn't make a miracle, but it would make things more open. I mean, if we had some kind of proportional system. Mélenchon is claiming to do that, just what I'm speaking about, but it's not very clear because even its party itself is very centralized in a way, and it's very, I mean, organized around one person. It's a bit presidential too, and that's a limit. I mean, about Mélenchon system.
Thank you, Bernard. And Bouna, Monia, would either of you like to come back on either of those questions?
I can take the first question.
Sure.
Don't mind. So regarding Mélenchon and his bargaining power, I've been following the trends in the polls for the past 4 months or so, and none of the institutions had predicted that Mélenchon would be so high, right? He got almost 22%. So his political movement, the Popular Union Populaire, has become hegemonic in the left. And some political parties and candidates in the left did not want to, unite with him for the first round, but now they have to face the reality. The reality is that his, the philosophy, the political philosophy and the political party that he's embodying, the movement he's embodying, has become hegemonic. And as you know, beggars cannot be choosers. So the candidates whose party has been defeated, they have to, if they want to ensure that the left has the possibility to win the parliamentary elections, their only chance is to unite with Mélenchon, right? And actually, this is what is currently happening because according to the last information I could read in the media, most parties, so the Green Party, the Communist Party, have decided, so the Green Party got less than 5%, 4%, 4.6%, I think. The Communist Party even less, 2%. So they have decided to build a union with Mélenchon for the next parliamentary elections. But I think Mélenchon does not want to unite with the Socialist Party. So this election has confirmed that the Socialist Party is almost clinically dead. So their only chance, it would be to unite with Mélenchon. But the problem is Mélenchon has become so powerful that he doesn't even want the Socialist Party anymore. Like there are some figures from the Socialist Party that might bend with Mélenchon, Taubira, for example, and Ségolène Royal, former presidential candidate. They called the people from the so-called left to vote for Mélenchon for the first round, but now Mélenchon's movement has become hegemonic, and the only thing that the other political movements on the left have to do or can do if they want to stay alive is to make some concessions and accept that the Union Populaire has become hegemonic. That's what I wanted to say about that first question.
Thanks, Bouna. I'm going to read out one more question and then we'll go to Monia. So Richard Cohen says, let's go counterfactual. Can anyone on the panel say what would have happened if Mélenchon's share of the vote in the first round had been 2% higher and therefore his party had gone into the second round? Where would the Le Pen first round votes have gone? Which is an interesting counterfactual. Monia, over to you. Please feel free to comment on any of these questions.
Well, I don't know who the Le Pen voters would have voted for if she wasn't on the second round. I mean, for 5 years, the Le Pen voters, the supporters, have been hating on Emmanuel Macron, so I don't think they would have voted for him, or reluctantly, maybe they would have done it, but I think they utterly hate the Islamo-leftist Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Therefore, I don't think they would have voted for him. Yeah, that's a tricky question, but Mélenchon was a sort of providential man. He came as a savior for the Muslim community and said he would protect and defend our rights and our liberties. And nearly 70% of Muslims voted for him, actually. He is the only candidate that condemned discrimination against Muslims. But he was elected deputy in Marseille in 2017, and his assessment is just disastrous. What has he done for people in Marseille? Absolutely nothing. I know a lot of people who live in Marseille and who complain about the fact that Mélenchon hasn't been doing anything. So the problem with the left is that it has never really been anti-racist, basically. The minorities realized that after the Socialist Party deceived us. But originally, left parties were against the arrival of cheap immigrant workforce coming from North Africa or Africa in general. And us minorities have noticed, we have realized that the left parties, the traditional parties, are not basically our friends. They're not willing to help our condition. And we noticed that with Manuel Valls. Manuel Valls was supposed to be a left. He was a former minister of François Hollande, and he was as Islamophobic as Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. So, as I said, Muslims and generally speaking, the minorities are disappointed by all these politicians, and we are not fooled by even Mélenchon's promises to defend us. That's why we have decided that we have to exist politically, independently, and that we have to represent ourselves and to do what needs to be done ourselves, basically, and that's why we are running for the next legislative elections.
Thank you, Monia. So there's another question in the chat. There's also one question in the question and answer box that I'd like to answer from Giles Morin, which is, why is Islam plagued with radicalization when other religions are not? And how come no one has been killed in France by Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Catholics, Protestants, etc.? And I'd just like to answer this question. Perhaps normally people would ignore that question, but I do think it's quite important to address these kind of issues. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to combat what we would say is Islamophobia. And personally, of course, this idea that it's only Muslims who are radical or are able to be extremists is completely wrong and is part of the problem. So, I mean, I shouldn't have to give examples, but if you remember back in 2011, the far-right extremist Anders Breivik, who did a mass shooting at a Norway youth camp and killed 77 people. There was the Christchurch massacre where many Muslims were murdered, and the consequence of the rhetoric, the Islamophobic rhetoric that ministers and politicians espouse, and the media espouses too, is violence towards women of color, people of color, Muslims. The police brutality that we experience day to day results in deaths in custody. So actually some of the biggest victims are people of color. So that's one thing. And further, if you look at the history of Europe and many of the genocides that have been committed by extremist and fascist groups, which we don't have to go into, it is clear that the question you've asked and its premises are false. So I just thought that was something that needed to be addressed. Another question that is in the chat is more positive. France has 5 years before Le Pen bounces back at the next election. What practical steps do you think Macron can take to improve the situation of the French population so that they don't feel she will be the way to take in 5 years' time? And I think that's a good question to also roll your concluding thoughts into as well. So I'll go to Bernard, Bouna, and then finish with Mouna.
Well, I don't know what Macron will do. If he has a majority at the National Assembly in the next election in June, he will do nothing positive, absolutely nothing. He will follow the same policy, more or less, the few words changing. If he has not, then the situation is much more open, because there would be some capacity of pressure, and maybe we can improve, the situation can be improved on certain social issues and on certain ecological questions. That's basically the situation. I mean, I'm not very optimistic in the short term. What is important is that, despite all the limits that has been always already said by the limit of the left parties in France, the raising of a new generation and a new left will propose a real alternative. I mean, I was working on this subject with people from the movement Attack, and we wrote something a few months ago about that, saying that we will see in 2 or 3 years the rise of a new ecological, anti-racist and social movement in France. There is a premise of it.
Thanks, Bernard. Maybe just quickly, Raouf says he has a question. I'll just see if I can allow him to ask his question. Raouf?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. I have just a question about presidential election 2022. As you know, all if we can call that a neuro clash between liberal and a new nationalist is establishing already in Europe, and I think France is coming. My question is, how could the 2022 presidential election, French presidential election, impact the dynamics of European integration? Thank you.
Thanks, Raouf. Okay, if we could roll that into your closing remarks, Bouna, and then Monia. I know that, of course, you will be leaving to break fast for iftar in 10-15 minutes time, so we do have to wrap up soon. Over to you, Bouna.
Yes, thank you, Seema. If you allow me, I would just like to make a very quick comment on the question that was asked by Gilles regarding, the violence of Islamism. I just wanted to remind him that one of the founding books of Islamism was published in 1927 by Abu Ala Maududi during the British rule in India, right? So the book was titled Jihad in Islam. So the question that he can ask himself is, why did it take almost 60 years for a terrorist attack to happen, not only in France, but also in Muslim countries? So there is also a historical background that you need to take into account if you want to understand this phenomenon. And by the way, Osama bin Laden was a friend, ally of the Americans in Afghanistan when he wanted to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, right? So these are historical arguments that you need to consider if you want to analyze the phenomenon. And last point on this, there is a book that was published earlier this year. I think it was last year, 2021, by Robert Giltier, was a British historian teaching at the Oxford University. So if you are more interested, so the title of the book is Empires of the Mind. If you're interested, I really recommend that you read it because it's going to give you some historical perspective on why political Islam, violent jihadism has emerged in some Muslim countries, why it has affected former colonial empires like France and Britain. So this is the small remark that I wanted to make. Then regarding the questions on Macron and how he can implement some policies that will counteract the potential rise of Marine Le Pen, her rise to power in the next 5 years. The question is, does he really have interest to do that? Because from what I understood, his plan is to favor the far right, I mean, at least politically, and then present himself as the ultimate alternative, right? That's what he did for this election, for this past election in 2022. He's done everything to promote politically the far right using their rhetoric, implementing policies that Marine Le Pen wouldn't have disproved. So the question is Macron really willing to counteract the rise of the far right? I'm not convinced. I think it's also part of their plan to implement some national liberal policies, so nationalism for the poor and liberalism for the rich. And this also partly answers the question that was asked by Raouf. So the second part of the question asked by Raouf is, how is the French presidential election going to affect European integration? Well, interestingly, most European leaders have congratulated Macron for his re-election. You know, the context is very, has substantially changed over the past few months, as you all know, because since the war in Ukraine started, there is a kind of consensus within Europe on identifying the common enemy, right? So I think that if you want to understand the impact of the French elections on the European integration, you also have to take into account that the attacks, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia will bring more unity within Europe, including with people like Orban, who've been historically close to Putin. So now the tendency is more getting closer to NATO and the US foreign policy and implementing some, the neoliberal agenda, pursuing the neoliberal agenda that has been applied for the last 30 years. There will be some resistance, but obviously Macron can invoke the foreign relation imperatives to, you know, to quiet down the social protests within France. Thank you.
Thank you, Bouna. Munir, over to you. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. I would like to answer Gilles as well, because he has clearly been influenced by the media that vilifies Islam and Muslims by conflating Islam and terrorism. I need to remind him that actually Islamophobic laws are fueling terrorism actually by giving arguments to ISIS or any other terrorist organization to attack France or any other country that insults Islam. So I think it's just ridiculous. In France, there has been terrorist attacks that was coming from real separatists, like in Corsica, for example, because we are accused of separatism. There was a bill called the against the so-called Islamist separatism, but believe it or not, there are real separatists in France. In Corsica, for example, they are claiming they would like to be independent. As for us Muslims, we have no, we are not planning to secede. We're not planning to create an Islamic state in France. It's ridiculous. All we want is to be treated just like anybody else. And this paranoia reminds me of the theory of the Great Replacement. A lot of people believe actually in that theory. That was Eric Zemmour, one of Eric Zemmour's arguments, and Marine Le Pen as well. So more and more French people believe that one day they will be replaced by Muslims. We are only 10% of the population in France. Believing in this theory is just preposterous. Yeah, and as you said, Seema, the terrorists that killed more than 50 people in two mosques in Christchurch came to France, actually, and that's where he learned about this great replacement theory. That's where he radicalized, actually. So there are terrorists everywhere, and we should not be playing that game, divide and rule, and blaming on Muslims for some lunatics' actions and that don't represent Islam.
Thank you, Monia. I think we are going to have to wrap up there, I'm afraid. Bernard, I don't know if you want to quickly respond in like 1 minute to the why so anti-Mélenchon when he is a leader that engenders left policies and mass public support question. If you can do that in 1 minute, that would be great.
Well, it's also a long story. I mean, Mélenchon is not a newcomer in French politics. So he had all the occasion to have problem with other leftist tendencies before. And he's not, as I said, he has a very personal way of dealing with politics. I hope that in the coming weeks and months, there will be a real unity, not only between leaders of the leftist parties, but I say bottom up. I mean, among the rank and file and in the district, etc. Maybe it's possible with this new Union Populaire. We will see.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us from France, all of you. It's been great to hear from you. It's been a pleasure to hear your experiences. We hope this won't be the last of our collaboration. There's so much that we can do to connect our movements and to join forces against the far-right governments across both of our countries. I've posted a link in the chat, but if anyone who's watching today wants to continue to support Another Europe is Possible in building links of solidarity, holding events like this and our other campaigns, please do consider joining us because we run on membership fees and we really do need your support. Thank you, everyone. We're approaching time to break fast in France. So Ramadan Mubarak, Eid Mubarak to those who'll be celebrating over the weekend. And I hope to see you at more Another Europe events. Thank you. Bye.